Okay.
Sage,
Yes.
it's Hank. I don't see myself. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, all right. I'm here, but am I in the video?
You
Hi,
are
Yes.
not.
everybody. I am. All right. Well, as long as I can be heard. Hi, everybody. I don't see myself here. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, just raise your hand if you're not here. So today's topic is kind of a whammy. Uh, it's I'll reiterate this again, that a quote that came from one of the authors, Michael Muthakrishna, of the paper that I shared for us to read, and I'll put it in the chat again now, and some of you may not have seen it, that dual inheritance theory is as close as we may have to a formal theory of human behavior. And really, it encapsulates a theme that we've mentioned many times here in Examine Lies, which is, in addition to genetic evolution, there is cultural evolution. And I think we've accepted and discussed the various implications of cultural evolution and all kinds of modern evolutionary thinking. I think that already kind of assumes that there's, to humans at least, far more than just genetic evolution and genetic inheritance. But today is basically the macro theory that stitches it together, and really thinking of dual inheritance, of us as a dual inheritance species, changes the way that we think about canonical evolutionary problems and dynamics in a way that changes how we think about those same things for us versus other non-human animals. To emphasize the dual inheritance nature of our species, consider that our jaws are too weak and our guts are too short for a world without controlled fire and cooked food. We are genetically endowed with an expectation of a cultural environment that will have fire and cook food. And yet we have no innate ability to make fire or food. If you just woke up one day and you were raised on a desert island, and you wouldn't just invent fire. There's no instinct for fire. It's a cultural creation that many peoples have had and lost. You can see it in the records, in the archaeological record. And so our very essence is so intertwined with both cultural and genetic inheritance. It affects our biology, our cultural environment, those who, a canonical example from weird societies. This is an acronym: Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic. Of weird societies have high rates of literacy. They're formal schooling, teaching, reading, and writing. This actually changes the very biology of the brain, making us better at distinguishing abstract symbols and worse at recognizing faces. You can actually see the part of the brain that has been changed. And so our culture is not just stuff we learn and do, but it is deeply interwoven with everything that we might call our phenotype. And so the whole idea of the phenotype needs to be revised in light of this. It's not just the proportion of genetic, it's not just our genetic expression, and whether a trait is heritable is not just up to whether our genes, the variance in our genes. It is also due to the variance in our culture. And this is one of the main points that the article shares, which is, because you have these two parallel streams of inheritance, heritability of any trait is an interactive calculation. It's multiplicative, not summative, between your cultural and your genetic variance. And depending on how that shakes out, the heritability of a given trait in genetic terms may change. Culture can mask genetic effects. So there's a point at which it's talked about how the level of equality or homogeneity in a cultural environment can actually accentuate the genetic differences, because the only variance left to explain differences in traits is differences in genes. So then we might feel like the genetic heritability is really strong for a trait, like an IQ. If everyone has formal schooling, well, then schooling is not going to be very explanatory. But when those differences are much higher, and there are some people who have almost none and very high amounts of schooling, suddenly school is the biggest explanation of IQ, because the genetic variability is far less. And so it's a moving target. That's something Steve mentioned at the beginning when we were just talking. And I think that's a perfect way to describe it. And I'll leave it off in this moving target with this additional quote that I think puts it perfectly. Thanks, Steve, for sharing this on the high-low. We must start from recognition that all complex human traits result from a combination of causes. If these causes interact, keyword, it is impossible to assign quantitative values to the fraction of a trait due to each, just as we cannot say how much of the area of a rectangle is due separately to each of its two dimensions. And a key theoretical mathematical piece here is that we're talking about interactions, and we're talking about multiplying factors, not just adding them up. You can't add up length and width and get area. It's their interaction. So I think that kind of sets the stage, and there's lots of kind of pet examples and cool things we could talk about, but the implications of the theory in general are massive. And so it's just worth opening up. So please use your hand raise and we'll form a queue. Steve.
I'll just share one other definition of dual inheritance theory that I read that I liked. And this author described it as, quote, a two-person variable sum game in which genes and culture compete to control phenotype. I thought that was a pithy description as well. And it is helpful to think of it in that way, in a way that culture and genes are not only interacting, but to some degree, if you think of it almost as they're competing to see which one accounts for the most variability in the phenotypic behavior.
Well, sorry, can
My name is Surinder Parasar, and I'm a retired professor of biology and living in St. Augustine right now. But I do want to sort of share with you that one of the subject that's catching a lot of attention, or should catch a lot of attention, is the subject of coevolution. Coevolution means no organism is living by itself. It lives in company of other organisms, and both are evolving in response to each other. And there are some wonderful examples of those. And I think we need to move away from seeing evolution just simply between our genes changing and studying them, but rather than seeing how our genes and phenotypes respond to genes and phenotypes of other associates that we carry with us or carry on us, in us, with us. And so we are a sort of a complex community of ecosystems. And I think we should see ourselves as ecosystems. And in that context, I think we would have a lot more progress on this subject area.
Well, thank you so much.
I don't know if I like it. Our subject was coevolution.
Yeah, no, I think that's highly relevant and exactly what the interactive dynamics are pointing to, as opposed to separability, measuring all of these kind of different pieces and sort of coming up with a number that explains something in a single value. Doesn't really reflect. You can get that same number from multiple interactions. So what does that number tell you? Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Sage, and thank you, Steve. Steve read a quote that described what culture and genes and culture as competing in some ways to influence the phenotype. You would never say that length and width of a rectangle compete to define the area of the rectangle, right? In some ways they cooperate to define the area of the rectangle. And I think for many human traits, culture and genetic, the dual streams of inheritance sort of amplify each other rather than try to compete, than simply compete for dominance. So not that Steve is wrong in any way, but there's more to the story here, I think. Also, I wonder about the prominence of the word mask. There's a claim in the abstract of the paper you guys linked where what cultural effects can mask the expression of genes. Well, fair enough, but why pull out that verb? I mean, can't cultural effects amplify genetic effects? Can't they create them? Can't they nullify them? Aren't there, in fact, many, many different verbs that we should be looking at here? Why focus on masking?
Yeah, that is one stickier point there, and I think it's emphasized because of the history of thought, and it's important to note that as far as I can tell, the use of the word mask is in reference to a statistical calculation of heritability, and in the statistical version of masking, basically pointing to the fact that we're just going around measuring people's genes and then measuring their traits and then saying, here's their heritability of that trait, and ignoring the interactive dynamics of culture, exogenizing everything that is actually interacting with the system. And so the point of masking is basically just to call attention to the fact that our whole paradigms of heritability have been ignorant to this. But you're right that so that's an epistemological point. But the ontological point, the thing I think that's more important, is that the other verbs you hint at around the ways that these things interact, and that masking, yes, if you're an evolutionary biologist, you should be taking note at that and waking up in the middle of the night. But for the rest of us, point taken, what are the implications? So yeah, I'm right there with you. And I wanted to reflect on that competition piece, which is to point out, well, how does culture versus genes, which comes into play? And maybe one key rule of thumb that we can lean on, and I think this is good, is the predictability or uncertainty of the environment. So there's a pretty much a direct relationship between how stable and predictable the environment is, and then the extent to which genetic evolution is able to provide solutions. But in more unstable or uncertain environments, where trial and error is needed, picture a squirrel looking to hide a nut. It knows that it needs to hide a nut, but where it needs to hide that nut, it has to figure it out. And there's no genetics that can answer that because it's so uncertain. And for us, culture is often coming in many cases to address uncertainty, but then to also create stability in the environment. Once everyone goes to school, the uncertainty of that changes a lot. So, there are dynamics. Okay, we have a good cue here. So I'll go to Hank, Diane, and then Kathleen.
Good morning again. I thought I got something this morning that I only read quickly, but I thought it applies to this, what we're talking about. So here's a quote. It's from a historian, Henry Adams, back in, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. If politics as a practice, whatever its professions, has always been the systemic organization of hatreds. So I thought, I don't know if people want to take this on to put it in the context of dual inheritance, but it strikes me about politics or affiliation for the purpose of getting one's goals accomplished is the way I think of politics, rather than, the way it's done in the media. I don't know if people want to address that on a more scientific level, like how the hell does that happen? Is it the cooperation of, well, we have genetics in this about whatever hatred means or destruction, or, and then there's, pro-social activity, which is not necessarily about affiliation for the purpose of accomplishing a goal. So I don't know if it's worthwhile to discuss or just I pass it along to make it practical again.
Thanks, Hank. That's out there in the air, and anyone can pick up on it. We'll go to Diane.
Yeah, I saw the same quote, Hank, in A Word a Day, right? And I sent it around to some friends because I thought it was quite striking, but probably fits somewhere in coalition theory within, evolutionary psychology. I wanted to say something sort of naive, actually, which, if I can get an answer to this, I think I know what we're talking about better. What question does each of these different approaches try to answer? I mean, when you ask the question, how much is explained by environment and how much is explained by genetic inheritance? What are we actually trying to explain? What is that question about? Is it about the individual? Is it about the species? Is it both somehow? But when we say, how do the environment and genetic inheritance interact to produce a phenotype? Are we talking about individual phenotypes, or are we talking about whole species? In other words, what's our basic unit of analysis?
Mm-hmm. I think our basic unit of analysis is phenotypes or traits, and it's how do we have these traits? What is causing them to be the way that they are? And in species without culture, and in a conception of evolution without culture, we're just thinking about genes and environment. But there's also niche construction and behaviors that can create environments for genes. So, I mean, it's not as clear cut even as that. But when we bring culture into the picture, it's about genes and culture. And the environment is the backdrop in which these things are interacting and being selected for. But I think the heart of it is really just the heart of what evolution is about, which is what makes it a broad topic. But how do things become the way that they are? Why are they these ways and not other ways?
So are we basically saying, okay, let's pay a lot of attention to culture as part of the environment within which the organism is behaving?
I think, yes. I think there's two insights. One is that when we think about humans and we think about sticky problems and applications of evolutionary thought to humans, things like intelligence or, those kinds of topics, they get mired in questions of genetic determinism, and it turns out that if we're taking the same approach as we do with other evolutionary systems for other species, we're going to get confused because that's not the same story. It's a different system. We have a whole nother level of inheritance that no other species has. So you can't explain it in the same kind of like the tie overs are they always have to be capitulated around that. On the other hand, a lot of what we would feel like are sticky problems are actually kind of common sense, not nearly as confusing as we might have thought in the relationship of IQ and education, socioeconomic status. There's this like sort of obvious insight around like, well, it's not just genes, right? Because look at all these other things that are different. And it's not just that the environment is different. So we're moving past nature and nurture as well, and kind of qualifying what nurture really means, that it's not just some environment that helps genes be expressed or not expressed, but is actually a separate contributor to the very traits that we observe. So that's what's at stake. And I think a lot of the kinds of areas that we struggle to explain for humans, but do well for other animals, this is at the heart of it. The lack of addressing of this separate stream of inheritance. Does that help you, or do you feel still? It's a big, yeah. Maybe I'll let Steve jump in. I feel like he has something.
I think I'm next.
Oh, right. Sorry, Kathleen. I lost you in the chat.
Well, I just wanted to speak now because my reflection kind of connects to what Diane was saying. I'll start with a brief personal comment. I grew up in a household with a father who was very racially bigoted. And as teenagers, my sister and I had a conversation almost every night at dinner table around the nature versus nurture issue. And I've been thinking about this for a long time. I have my undergraduate degree was in psychology. I became a Montessori teacher. I have a graduate degree in clinical psychology and a diploma in organizational psychology. And I think it's important to just look at the obvious, that childhood, early childhood, and childhood in general in the human species is so long. There's so much of cultural influence in how people become functional. And in particular, the interpersonal neurobiology perspective, the multidisciplinary interaction between brain development, biological lifespan within a community, and attachment is really important. And as an undergraduate, I was very privileged and blessed to have spent a year studying the strange situation tapes that were created by Mary Ainsworth, a student of John Bowlby, and spent many hours watching the movement of babies' eyes going to the mother and other people, and the looks on their faces, and analyzing what was happening in terms of their attachment. And I'm just starting to read The Secret of Our Success. A lot of the studies cited early in that book regarding the importance of cultural role in how people become competent focuses on those kinds of early childhood studies, looking at where is the toddler, who's he looking at, who do they emulate, what's the influence of prestige or trust, and that's all related to attachment as well. So for me, I'm glad you brought out that the phrase masking really refers to a statistical issue, which is that I think it's impossible to really pull out and separate at a certain point where one begins and the other ends in terms of genetics and culture. Clearly, there's some very strong differences with people who have specific differences that make it hard for them to cope with certain levels of culture. But you know, that's the excitement for me in life at this point, is that I believe really strongly that we're at a stage where we can really harness the potential of cultural adaptation to make some big system changes in terms of how people experience themselves, one another, and their relationship to the world around us. Check.
Thanks, Kathleen. That was probably the better answer to Diane's point. That's and it leaves us with a big, exciting question: and how do we update all of these priors, and what does this mean? I think that's what we're here for. But that is the context. This nature versus nurture. That there's a deep assumption about separability in there, that an understanding of complexity. It's just an outdated way of thinking. So it's just like the billiard balls model of the universe, you know, that it's all just bouncing from the beginning of time till now it's deterministic. Actually, no, there's high uncertainty and probability in each moment, and that the interactions of this uncertainty creates whole different timelines that never would have, you couldn't know which one you would have went down. So these are the kinds of things that are all kind of coming into play, I think, and we're talking about this for this theory, but there's more than just this theory and this perspective that these kinds of deeper shifts are bringing to light. Let's go to Steve.
Before I say what I put my hand up about, I just wanted to react to one thing Kathleen said. You were talking about the lengthy period of childhood. And in the YouTube talk by one of the authors that I linked to on Hilo, he speculates that that one reason that Homo sapiens have such lengthy juvenile periods is that our brain size reached its maximum in terms of anatomically what we're able to birth. And so we, as culture progressed, there was so much information to pass on to the next generation. We couldn't do it with an increased brain size, so we did it by lengthening the juvenile period. I thought that was an interesting observation. But what I had put my hand up about was to say just two things. One is, I don't think in the article we read that they actually define culture in a way that I would have preferred. I'm not sure what definition we all would agree on. Perhaps in the context of the article, culture are activities and practices that alter the ecology or the environment that we are in. But the other thing I wanted to share is that one of the big takeaways for me from reading that article in terms of heritability was the relationship between how the variation in the environment affects heritability estimates, that the higher the variation in an environment, the lower the heritability coefficient. And conversely, the lower the variability in an environment, the higher the heritability coefficient. And that really was struck me. And they talk about that repeatedly through the article and use that to explain, for example, why we find some socioeconomic differences in IQ heritability and all kinds of things. But I thought that was a really important point of the article.
Hank.
Yeah, I thought I would, if people don't pick up on it, I thought I would try to explicate it with something that I was thinking about. I have a little dog and she's 12 years old. Her name is Phoebe. And once I got the dog, I became interested in studying the behavior of animals. And what I learned from practical, some consultation, reading, is that we train dogs and my little dog trains us. So she's been around about 8 years and we're training each other so much better the more time we have together. And she signals better and I know how to read the signals better. But let's say for the biologists here, or how do domesticated dogs, obviously, how do they learn to train us to provide them what they need for survival and thriving? So I don't know if people, I'm trying to bring it down to earth to these complicated concepts, but I see that happening with people too. And as a psychotherapist, I think about the client and the therapist training each other for the purpose of the person's development. It's not an easy process, but I think some of you know about this. But does anybody want to think about, especially the scientists here, about this? How do domesticated dogs learn to train us to look after them properly? And some of us do better at being trained, and some are terrible. Depends what, if you want to train a dog to kill people, well, you're not going to go to me. So, so just another way of addressing this issue in a more practical level and on a small scale rather than, pro-sociality or the complicated concepts we as academics and scientists like to think about it. Anybody have dogs? Or kids,
There's a lot to say there, but I think that's getting at Surindar's point around coevolution, right? And just thinking of this in terms of psychological function as the main kind of selecting force, but it's still selecting by consequences. And so you're learning how to do it better, which means that there's a way that you could do it worse. The dog's trying to say something, you're not getting it, then you do get it. There's a consequence. That's an evolutionary process. So I
In
think
other words, Sage, the dog knows because of some kind of heritability and cultural domestication how to train me. Is that one way to pinpoint it? Is it
at a deep level, yes, but I think that the microevolution is the real. There's nothing in your dog that is prepared for you. It learned that the hard way.
Okay, that's helpful. That's
Yeah.
right. On the micro level. Thanks.
Yes. Diane.
Yeah, I was every time somebody says something, I want to respond to all of them, and by the time I get here, I've forgotten what I wanted to say to Kathleen, for example. But for Hank, I think children and parents socialize one another in the same way that pets socialize their owners, and vice versa. But most of us are psychologists, and I don't think Sage is, but Sage, you answered in terms, my earlier question, in terms of traits. And traits are something that are shown by individuals. But something that's it's not unique to humans, but I think it's really, really especially well developed in humans, is the fact that we are both individuals and we are participants in groups, shifting groups, and so on and so forth. David Wilson's idea about multi-level evolution, I think, needs to be brought to bear here. And I didn't see that much of that in the article about dual inheritance, let's say. It's as if it's all individuals. But individuals become something else when they're operating in a group, even in a couple, even in a temporary interaction. And if we're going to have a really comprehensive kind of explanation, I think we need to be able to incorporate that reality. Okay, that's it for the minute.
Thanks, Diane. Let's go to Andy.
Yeah, I grew up at a time when scientists, social scientists in particular, talked a lot about the nature versus nurture debate. And right there in the word versus is the idea that those two factors compete for the larger share of the influence. And it's natural when you're working within that paradigm to ask, well, which is more responsible for, say, our intelligence? And you can see why people might answer that question with, oh, intelligence seems to be about 60% nature and 40% nurture, or whatever the numbers are. I mean, all of those questions make a certain kind of sense when you adopt the versus framing of it all. And I think one of the points of the article we were invited to read is that any such language is going to be misleading because the two factors have been interacting in complex ways for literally hundreds of thousands of years. I've been trying to think of a vivid way to make this point, and here's what I came up with. Suppose you and I collaborate to author an article. You draft it, I rewrite certain portions of it. You log back into the Google Doc and make about 100 edits, and I overwrite half of them and substitute a bunch more. If you've ever looked at the kind of the editing history of a collaborative Word doc, it can get really ugly, right? If you show all of the revisions, it becomes a complete mess, a complete tangle of contributions. That's got to be what we're looking at here when it comes to the ways in which genes and culture influence one another. If you zoom up close and actually look at the edit history, the history of actual edits, they've got to be enormously complex, to the point where the whole 60% versus 40% thing looks enormously misleading. So I don't know. So what do you think about the idea that genes and culture have been collaboratively evolving us for hundreds of thousands of years in the way that two collaborators on a paper might collaborate?
I love that question, Andy, and I'll add to it a insight from Jim Cohn, a psychologist, that he makes the point that the one constant of humans, of our species, has been the presence of other humans. So that, I think, is kind of Diane's point as well. It's like, well, what about everyone else? And culture is inherently a social process, and the way that genes and culture are shaping us over this long time is social. So there's something lost. There's a piece of information lost that's part of the story, and that we can only generalize in abstract ways, which was all the different groups of people and how they were and how they acted. I mean, we don't know. We weren't there. We can't recreate it. But that is such a critical part of the puzzle, and it's a constant. So there is an unknowability, I think, at the heart of it. If you know, the detail, the edit history is not, we'll never find it in that way.
Yeah, if I could just tack on a follow-up thought. If I was being interviewed about an article I co-wrote with you, Sage, and the interviewer asked, well, what percentage of this essay is your work and how much is Sage's? I might say something like, it's kind of 50-50 or something. And at a heuristic level, that might mean something. But suppose that in our conversations, early on in your conversations, something you said was like a seed crystal that sparked like a cascade of ideas in my mind. And then I went into the Word document and made a bunch of edits. The Google's tracking of the edits changing won't reflect the fact that one of your ideas was actually the seed crystal that led to a bunch of my ideas. So I might be inappropriately attributing some of the influence to myself, but in fact it came from you. That's got to be the same.
Yes, what's in the record and what's not, exactly. And path dependency. Well, that's a great question, and I think we can hold it. Hank.
I'd like to add a couple of things to the discussion that you folks are having. One is that we have a sort of misconception of what gene means, the term gene means. And we have absolutely poor concept of what we mean by intelligence. So we talk as if there are unitary structures, unitary things. But if you look at the real working of our DNA, all it's doing is making proteins, putting amino acids together in certain order, and these proteins work. Nothing more, nothing less. So when we think of a trait as complex as that you can think of, this is an example of between dog and human bonding. There are complex interactions. There are many genes, many proteins interact together in order to produce our behavioral change. So I think we should be very mindful of the fact that we really don't have a good notion of what a gene means. Gene is not a yardstick that we can use over and over again to do different things. I'm sorry to put a damper on some of the areas of your discussion. I thank you for listening to me.
That's critical point, and it's just bringing us down even a further level in terms of the interactions. And I think you could say the same as there's no such thing as an individual human. There's no such thing as an individual gene. They're inherently nested in a system. There's no function of a gene without the rest of the system, and there's no function of a protein without a biology to use it. And so the whole thing is only can be understood as a system otherwise. So when we atomize and we talk about these different pieces, it's a convenience of our mind, but it is definitely can confuse us. And I think when you really think about how do all these genes create all these proteins, and then those proteins somehow affect the way that I talk with my dog, man, we are pretty far from having a clear idea of any of this. So thank you for breaking that through. I want to go to Kathleen Hart.
Hi, I mean, I hope I got this right, but what you were saying reminds me of the evolution of childhood. And sometimes people imagine it to be humans got smarter and smarter, and therefore it took longer and longer for a child to, therefore, babies had to be born helpless or they wouldn't fit through the birth canal and so on and so forth. When I think what's really going on is that more and more the group, the mother giving birth depended on the group, and the group's cooperation in order to make sure the child got raised to adulthood resulted in greater cognitive skills. So that it's not just the idea of, well, each individual human got smarter and smarter and was able to learn how to do something like build fires, but that it was actually this group activity without which the child would not grow up to have all these incredible cognitive skills that come from interacting with different members of a cooperative group. So this is another way of, remembering how complicated it is.
Hank.
So much to react to, but I want to go my response to Sundar's comment, from the kind of, micro evolutionary, almost micro atomistic protein building. But I guess this could be another topic, but taking a look at that point of view and the whole notion of human consciousness, which, it's not the first discussion about it here. There's so much material, but I think that would be an interesting topic to think about it from this kind of the biological point of view first, the way Sundar presented it. How does that become, let's say, the way Sage said, well, each one of us is going to have a different way of talking to any dog, but that's something about this magical mysterium tremendum of human consciousness. Okay, that's one point, but thank you, Sundar. The other, I was thinking a colleague of mine who was, let's say he was more of a clergyman than he was academic scientist, but he talked about, he was trying to get something together called the dogma-free zone, which I'm taking up. And I was thinking on this level, well, what is it in our evolution? We know cultural, we have alliances and stuff that I get, and I guess we're wired somewhere in our heritability on the biological level to be part of a group. I think that kind of wiring we could probably agree to. But how do you move from dogma zone, which is kind of early on, not versus dogma-free zone, but But how do the two kind of relate to each other rather than as a dichotomy? But the way Andy said, it's like nature, not versus nurture, but nature and nurture, how they interact. So how the dogma-free zone and dogma zones interact to shape us as individuals, as well as, as some kind of species. So I'm just getting hyped up and thinking about stuff. It's fabulous.
Yes, Sundar.
It occurs to my mind, it's in late 1970s and early 80s. Coppinger, I'm thinking, in the Amherst, Massachusetts, he was interested in domestication of dogs. And he and some other came up with this idea that what's happening in our own biological evolution as compared to other primates is that we become sexually mature in our juvenile stage. So juvenility has stretched to such a point that we become lifelong learners. And they find from other species of our close relatives that the adults, they do not do any exploratory behavior, where the young, on the other hand, they are risk takers. They are, exploring various niches. And his response was essentially that we have our sexual maturity in juvenile stage has resulted in that we become lifelong learners. We experience this, and our adulthood is postponed until many decades later in our life. There, I don't know how that idea will sit with some of you, but that might give you some explanations why we are good learners. Thank you again.
Hank, did you have a response to that or a new thought?
Who, me?
Hank, because you posed a question and
You're muted, Hank.
I wanted to, I don't think I could say back the pithy point of what you were making. So can you kind of reframe it? I lost track. So I don't know if you need my response, but I would love to, but I was going to ask it, but I didn't want to interrupt. Sundar or somebody else.
I'm sorry, are you looking for a response from me?
Well, yeah, since you're the one who spoke, but I kind of lost track.
What was it? What was your question?
I kind of lost track of your central point.
Central point was that exploratory behavior, which is associated with our learning new things, has become stretched out in our own biological evolution. It's still, in other words, childhood is a period of learning, and we have become lifelong learner by virtue of the fact that our adulthood development has been postponed. You mean like,
yeah,
does it make sense?
Yeah, now I get it. I was just going to say the value and the stifling of curiosity is a cultural motif that either promotes exploratory behavior or curiosity on that level, or stifles it in dogmatic or, whatever, how the social media operates, how modern digital stuff, or critical thinking could be another way of thinking about exploratory behavior. And in terms of Andy, of your mental immunity, there are so many factors that interfere with exploratory behavior or critical thinking, and even critical thinking. What is the nature nurture? Where is that in our evolution? This lower level of critical thinking, which is it safe or not safe, to what's the dual inheritance theory, which is a whole other. So yeah, thanks for responding. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's go to Steve.
I wanted to raise a new point or a different point. In all of this complexity and interaction, though, I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that some traits are more genetically heritable than other traits. And I had posted something on Hilo that occurred to me in this regard. And so I wondered if hypothetically, if one did a research study where you measured a trait or several traits across different environments or across different cultures, you could specify the genetic heritability of a trait with a mean, the average for all of those cultures, but with a standard deviation. And then when you compared traits, if you measured multiple traits across multiple environments, the traits that in a sense had a lower standard deviation, one could, I think, say are more heritable, because there'd be the standard deviation, the variance attributable to environmental difference would be less. And I think that follows logically, but the main point I wanted to make, though, is that what I first said is that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that some traits are more heritable than other traits.
Yeah, absolutely. Not everything is culturally. It's dual inheritance, and the streams can ebb and flow, and absolutely that it's and then much of what we might have genetically that we would imagine. It's always helpful if you really want to have a null case for a culture, is just imagining a single child on a desert island that somehow figures out how to survive. There's all sorts of things it's not going to invent. It's not going to invent algebra, probably not accounting system either, maybe not even language, because who's there to talk to? So that kind of starts to help you realize how much of it is dependent on the cultural piece. But there's all sorts of behaviors and things that who will do, and that are, just as a pet example. But I think the idea here is that actually if we get clear on the ways that these are interact, and we can separate statistically, not ontologically, but we actually can get at the piece that, all right, well, how much of this is just genetic, and things like eye color are an easy example, and certainly. So
well, and I was thinking, for example, within psychology of the big 5 personality traits. And my hunch would be that they might have higher heritability than other more secondary or ancillary characteristics.
Kathleen Walsh.
Well, I have to admit I haven't finished reading The Secret of Our Success, but that the issue of the trying to single out the contribution of culture to survivability, which of course is central to the idea of genetic inheritability, are the examples he uses of how Western explorers who went to the Arctic Circle and then were marooned were unable to survive when there were many indigenous people living there who had figured it out. And he talked about a group of sailors that were marooned. They were locked in by ice for 19 months. And in 19 months, they never figured out how to harpoon a seal. And they starved to death and perished. So I just think, although there was a bunch of smart people here, and we can come up with these sort of challenges to certain ideas, but for me, the question's answered in terms of the role of culture when you drill down to the individual level and the need for nurturance in some kind of human family, even if it's a bond with a single person. I mean, there's a few documented, well, there's myths about children being raised by wolves, but never a baby, a young child raising themselves. It's just a question of what the value of understanding the role of the dual inheritance, of cultural inheritance, that I find really interesting. And I'm grateful that we're bringing this out as an idea, because I think it just has a lot of potential for understanding, well, what are the elements of culture that shape things like personality? What are those elements of culture that impact how people interact within those small groups and larger groups that define human culture in terms of the outcomes? And we can just have a gross standard of survivability, or what it means to be human, or have a meaningful life in terms of human values. Check.
Andy, happy to give you the last word here.
Oh, I'd love to build on what Kathleen just said. So imagine that it became a pressing issue for biologists, anthropologists to answer the question, to what extent is the human capacity to hunt successfully heritable, genetically heritable versus culturally acquired? You know, that you could imagine them rendering an answer based on the studies they've done in this African savanna. And then you look at a case like the European explorers who perished in the Arctic for lack of a culturally acquired seal hunting skill. And you realize that, you know, their survivability in the Arctic has dropped to zero. In other words, you might give a very different answer to the question, how much of human hunting ability is acquired versus heritable, depending on the cultural context, right? It's almost to the point where a numeric answer to that question almost seems silly.
I think that's the point of it, right? Is it's not that we can't quantify these things, but the idea of heritability as being a single number that we can just assign and go systematically through every trait and have a heritability score is what we're moving past, to not get stuck in situations where that seems totally counterintuitive. It's so easy to come up with the counterfactual when you do it that way. So that's a great place to leave it. And we will come back on, I believe, March 16th.
So before you close it down, Sage, may I again call it, for those of you who are able to have an inclination to help us with the mental immunity declaration, please, I'm going to paste the link, at the bottom of the thread here again. If you could copy it, there's two links, if you could copy it before Sage closes it down, that'll allow you to follow through with the relevant information. It's now at the bottom of the chat thread. Thanks again for those of you who are willing to take a look at that. About 10 minutes should do the trick.
All right, we can post those on Hilo too for those of you who are there, which you can find out how to join on the emails. Okay, so we'll see you next month, and we're going to have Steve host a discussion on evolutionary positive psychology.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.